A very few days more, and Captain Wentworth was known to be at Kellynch, and Mr Musgrove had called on him and had come back warm in his praise, and he was engaged with the Crofts to dine at Uppercross. I'm Harriet.
And I'm Ellen. And this is Reading Jane Austen.
This week we're reading chapters 7 and 8 of Persuasion. And once again we're joined by my partner Michael, who's going to be doing the historical bit and talking about the Navy.
Hello.
But let's start with 100-word summaries. So, do you want to go first?
I went over the word limit but didn't get round to cutting it down, so I'll read the whole lot.
Okay.
Captain Wentworth arrives at Kellynch. He still resents Anne's early refusal and is now determined to marry, but only someone free of her failings. Anne misses meeting him immediately because of an accident to her nephew, but is soon included in evenings at Uppercross. The two Miss Musgroves are fascinated by Captain Wentworth and the Navy, and as he recounts his career, she is reminded of their past together. He responds kindly to Mrs Musgrove's recollections of her dead son and teases Mrs Croft with his views of women on board. Evenings end in dancing, with Anne playing for them. Anne is always trying to guess Captain Wentworth's thoughts, but he treats her with coldness.
I've covered, I think, most of the same points you did. Captain Wentworth arrives and is invited to dinner at the Musgroves. Anne doesn't go as she's looking after Mary's eldest son, who has a dislocated collarbone, but she sees him the next morning when he comes to the cottage. The narrator tells us that Wentworth is now planning to marry anyone but Anne Elliot. One evening, he tells the fascinated Miss Musgroves about the ships he's served on. He says that women don't belong on ships, which Mrs Croft disagrees with and talks about her travels. The evening ends with Anne playing the piano so everyone can dance. So yeah, it's only 2 chapters we're doing this week because there were fewer chapters in Persuasion, but we still wanted to make it a 10 or 11 episode series. So starting with chapter 7, this is where Wentworth arrives and Anne is resigned to the fact that she's going to have to meet him. The first big thing that happens is they're supposed to be going to dinner, and then little Charles has his accident and Anne is the one who has to organise everything.
Again, we've got this picture of, as soon as possible, she tries to get hold of Charles to see if he can cope with Mary.
Yeah. And I like the fact that when it's first happened, both Mary and Charles are sort of unanimously concerned about little boy and saying, oh no, we can't possibly go out to dinner tomorrow night. So yeah, they do have concern for their offspring. They're not completely dismissive. But that's when they're frightened and don't know what's happening and think...
Actually, this is all part of this very beautiful building up of the relationship between Charles and Mary.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things I think is interesting about them, they're not really bothered about what other people will think. You know,
yeah.
When they're going through, they're talking to their own consciences.
Yeah.
They're not thinking, oh, what will people think?
Yeah.
They don't. There's just more is, can I or can't I?
The first night is, I don't want to go out because my little boy is sick. And the second night is, it's okay now, I can go out, so
yes.
I will. Although, one thing that I've missed on all of my earlier readings of this, you know, Charles is the first one who says, the child is doing better, so I think I can go to dinner with my father. But he says this the next day after he's come back from shooting. He had no issue with going off during the day, but still had to reconcile it with his conscience to go off in the evening.
Well, and the other thing sort of talking about in the evenings that struck me in that point was the point where Mary says, if you go away, I won't have anyone to talk to all evening. As though they so desperately need somehow to fill up the evening with other people.
Mm. Another picture we get of this relationship between Charles and Mary is when she says, husbands and wives generally understand when opposition will be vain, which Mrs Bennet doesn't, but let's not go there. And so Mary knew from Charles's manner of speaking that he was quite determined on going. So all she does is she then starts complaining to Anne.
Yes.
And it doesn't really tell you whether Anne is fed up with Mary about it or just thinks it will be easier all round if Mary goes too, because after all, she doesn't want to go and she has the excuse to stay home. And Mary is so tunnel vision about finding a justification to do what she wants to do, saying, my being the mother is the very reason why my feelings should not be tried. I'm not at all equal to it, so I should go out to dinner instead. She is profoundly irritating, but she's also, I think, a wonderful creation.
They're both entirely governed by their emotion of the moment. So when the accident first happens, they're overwhelmed by their own emotions of distress. But then, having peaked so high, they then come down and sort of go, bored now.
Now, one of the things I got fairly interested in these two chapters was Jane Austen is absolutely determined to tell us what the feelings of Wentworth and Anne are. But she does them in quite different ways. I mean, right at the beginning, she gives a completely straightforward account of what Captain Wentworth has felt about Anne in the past. Then she tells us a little bit more about what he feels when he's talking to his sister. And then we move on to, where in a sense we're not told what Captain Wentworth's feeling. We're told what Anne, looking at Captain Wentworth, remembering what he used to be like 8 years ago. And then she's guessing at his feelings.
Yeah.
And I think she's a bit hopeful about thinking how much he's going to be thinking about her.
Well, that's one thing I wondered. I'm sort of skipping ahead a bit here. When she talks about what Wentworth's feelings are, when it says, he had been most warmly attached to her and had never seen a woman since whom he thought her equal, but except for some natural sensation of curiosity, he had no desire of meeting her again. Her power with him was gone forever. Now, is that an actual representation of his feelings, or is it a representation of the narrative he is telling himself about his feeling?
What I think that is doing is it's primarily showing resentment.
Yeah.
It's showing that he has this picture of a weak character and how he disapproves morally of a weak character.
But yeah, it's like he thinks he has no desire to meet her again. He's moved on. Her power's gone forever.
Yes.
And in fact, he's completely wrong. So how much of that is in fact he has just convinced himself that that's the case?
I think it's mostly that he has. And then, of course, as it says, she is physically altered, and that becomes part of the justification narrative over her, and it's a kind of physical representation of what he regards as being her weakness.
In thinking about the picture of Captain Wentworth's feelings, I think, that's what Chapter 7 is doing, is we're getting it set up either straightforwardly in the authorial voice or in the authorial voice speaking the character's feelings.
Yeah.
And that's as far as we go in Chapter 7.
Yeah. But what we've skipped over is Anne, more than I think any other character, we get so much more emotion through the narrator's voice. Not just being told, but through the way it's told. And I'm particularly thinking of when he arrives at the cottage. It says, 1,000 feelings rushed on Anne, of which this was the most consoling, that it would soon be over. And it was soon over. In 2 minutes after Charles's preparation, the others appeared. They were in the drawing room. Her eye half met Captain Wentworth's. A bow, a curtsy passed. She heard his voice. He talked to Mary and said all that was right. Said something to the Miss Musgroves, enough to mark an easy footing. The room seemed full of persons and voices, but a few minutes ended it. And I just think the amount of turbulent emotion coming through in the way she says that, I don't think we've had that in other characters.
Do we not have it anywhere with Fanny? I mean, I can't think at this moment. And what about Marianne?
Marianne we almost always see externally filtered through Eleanor.
Yes. What we're seeing here is essentially stream of consciousness.
It's not so much stream of consciousness, it's standing there being like Anne, receiving impression. I cannot process these properly yet, but they're all coming at me.
It's turbulent emotions that we're seeing, and when they're not articulated specifically, I think she's really trying to get the sense of emotional upset, which is not quite stream of consciousness because it's not consciousness.
She's standing there, I can't process all this.
Yes, and then of course it says after that, Mary talked but she could not attend. She had seen him. They had met. They had been once more in the same room. Soon, however, she began to reason with herself and try to be feeling less. So we've kind of moved from that deep emotional reaction to stepping back.
Yes. And her trying to use what she's been doing for these last 8 years is never for a moment forgetting that she was deeply in love with Wentworth. He was deeply in love with her, but it's gone. But she doesn't want to undercut what happened in the past. She thinks that's terribly important.
But it's also in the past, and she accepts that it's in the past.
Well, she accepts it's no one she can talk to about it.
Yeah. I suppose the other thing we get in this chapter is the very clear setup of the Musgrove girls and Captain Wentworth, when it says their heads were both turned by him and off they ran.
Which is a lovely sentence, that picture.
And apparently more full of Captain Wentworth than of little Charles.
Yes.
Which, to be fair, little Charles is getting better.
Yes.
And Captain Wentworth is there in front of them being a really hot Navy officer.
Yes.
So chapter 7 is just the first encounter between Anne and Wentworth with the other events surrounding it. Chapter 8, after the setup that says they're continually meeting, most of it is this one evening at the big house where Captain Wentworth and Admiral and Mrs Croft, well, everyone's there. And so this is where it continues on with what you were saying about Anne's thoughts about Wentworth's feelings based on what she's observing.
And so she's continually there trying to interpret in terms of the past what it means when he does this or that or the other.
Okay. I don't see it that way. I see this dinner in particular as the first time we see and hear Captain Wentworth in his own voice.
Oh, I think the picture we get of Captain Wentworth in his own voice, that's a more significant part of this than Anne. I was just wanting to do this interpretation of Anne. No, I think that's absolutely the case, and I think that's what's wonderful about this chapter, is this picture.
Yes, we get to see Captain Wentworth as this confident, self-assured, successful military officer.
Just before Jane Austen started writing Persuasion, her brother Frank is on half pay, and I think he was renting Chawton House, you know, the big house. Deirdre Lafayette, I think with the last book she published, gives date by date what information we've got about what all the Austens are doing. And by July, Captain and Mrs Austen, that's Frank, they have dined at the cottage. In July, these are notes made by James's wife, Mary. We all dined at the great house. On the 2nd of August, Captain and Mrs Austen are back dining with them at the cottage. On the 8th of August, Jane Austen began Persuasion. By the 18th of August, Captain and Mrs Austen are dining at Steventon. And on the 24th of August, they're dining at Ash. So just as Jane Austen is starting to write Persuasion, you've got her brother dining all round the neighbourhood. And do we assume that he chats about his past? Jane Austen has obviously got this picture of what an officer can do when he's describing, you know, how he went off in the ass, how he went after privateers and he got frigate.
But Frank couldn't possibly talk like this because Frank didn't do any of the things that Captain Wentworth did.
Well, he didn't get any privateers or...
No, he was...
Yeah, but he could still talk about life at sea. And that's mostly what Captain Wentworth
He spent most of his time on blockade. To be very clear, neither of her brothers did any of that at any point. But there may have been gatherings of other naval officers.
I suppose the thing I was wanting to say more was he's behaving a bit like William Price. So even back when she was writing Mansfield Park, she had this view of the way he sits there telling everybody about his
Well, I suppose it's because it's different from everyone else, but the notes in one of the copies of Persuasion I have, I can't remember which, says that something that modern readers are less aware of, but a reader of the time would have been very, very aware of, is just the degree of admiration and adulation that naval officers got because there was this belief that they had saved England from Napoleon.
Yes.
I just think maybe we don't get the extent to which, whether they were successful or not, people would just hang on the words of naval officers or sailors describing their life because that was what saved us.
I think the best analogy I can come up with, and this is a 20th century one, being a naval officer at that point was like being a Battle of Britain fighter pilot.
I was going to say a Spitfire pilot too.
Yeah. And so you can just talk about it and people want you to talk about it.
Yes.
Are we going to talk about the sort of almost fat shaming of Mrs Musgrove, where Jane Austen talks about her large fat sighings? And
Well, I mean, that's quite interesting because, in effect, she apologises for doing it.
Yes.
I mean, she does it and then she says, well, I shouldn't have done
Yeah.
that. But
Yeah.
that's what we do.
yeah, she says, a large bulky figure has as good a right to be in deep affliction as the most graceful set of limbs in the world. But fair or not fair, there are unbecoming conjunctions which reason will patronise in vain, which taste cannot tolerate, which ridicule will seize, which is still ultimately pretty cruel.
But
Yeah,
on the other hand, that shows how lovely Captain Wentworth could be.
Yes.
Sits down beside her and talks to her and covers up everything that could upset her about Richard.
But also balanced with that is the stuff we talked about last time, where even though they started calling him Poor Richard, they've pretty much forgotten about him. Again, Jane Austen is being really callous about him, like we said last time.
Yes.
Whereas she somehow, in spite of the fat shaming, she's acknowledging that it may be exaggerated, but it is genuine grief. And I guess you have to say it's not so much grief for what he was, but what she felt he could have been.
Yes, I think that's so terribly sad in a way, where she says, this is what Richard might have been like.
Yes, the narrator leaves us in no doubt that, no, he was never going to be like Captain Wentworth because he was basically pretty useless. But yes, she fat shames. Yes, she says it's kind of ridiculous, but at the same time, she does acknowledge that it's maybe exaggerated and indulgent, but it's a real feeling that
Yes,
Mrs Musgrove
yes.
has. The last big piece in this chapter is the discussion of women on board ships and the beautiful, beautiful stuff that Mrs Croft says about how Wentworth is very pompously saying, oh, well, women don't belong on board.
You know, Wentworth is saying all this, but it's also, we've got this lovely picture of him teasing her.
Well, of course, we've also got to never forget that he and Mrs Croft are brother and sister, and she is quite a bit older than him. So they've probably had some sort of relationship.
I mean, I don't know how much older.
I'm not sure she's necessarily...
She still has to be older than Captain Wentworth. I would say at least 3 or 4 or 5 years
Yes,
older.
yes.
But yeah, not
But
10 or
not
15.
a generation older.
No.
No.
And therefore not a generation older than Anne.
Yeah.
How we tend to
Yeah.
assume...
Well, I suppose it's just because she's been married 15 years and she has done so much travelling in those
Yes.
15 years that even if she's not chronologically all that much older,
Yes.
she's got so much
Yes.
more lived experience.
Yes, yes.
Well, she's had so much naval experience.
She has travelled more than any other female character in all of Jane Austen, I think.
Yes.
Yes.
I can't think of another female Jane Austen character who's left England.
Well, you have to remember, for all their lifetime, you know, the continent as a place to go to has been out of bounds.
It would have been logistically possible to go to parts of Portugal.
They could, if they'd wanted to, have gone to Denmark and Sweden, perhaps. No, even those were under Napoleon.
After Nelson shelled Copenhagen, perhaps not the best place to go on holes if you're English.
Yeah.
With Mrs Croft's travels and her life experience, I do love the bit where she says that the only time she wasn't happy was the winter she was at Deal when Captain Croft, as he was then, was in the North Sea, and she was so anxious about him. And Mrs Musgrove says, I am quite of your opinion. I know what it is. For Mr Musgrove always attends the assizes, and I am so glad when they are over and he is safe back again.
I think that's so sweet with
Yeah.
Mrs Musgrove.
Mrs Musgrove is a lovely person,
Yeah.
but she also doesn't have a lot of vision.
No, no. By the Straits, does she mean the Straits of Gibraltar?
Yes.
Yes.
In the footnotes to one of my books. So,
So
it's
she's never been into the Mediterranean.
Yes.
Yeah, she's never been into the Mediterranean.
She's been zipping backwards and
Yeah.
forwards across
Yeah.
the Atlantic.
Yeah.
But she had been to India.
No, she'd been to the East Indies.
Well, yes.
Which, as we said when way back when we were talking about Sense and Sensibility,
Is-
could mean the Indian subcontinent. It could mean
It
many
could-
other places. While we're talking about this, I should say, as I've done with our other seasons, I've put together a Google map showing all the locations, and I've marked in all the places that Mrs Croft says she goes, and also where Admiral Croft has been and Captain Wentworth has been. That's on our website, and I'll link to it in the show notes. After the the lovely stuff about Mrs Croft talking about her travels. It finishes with Anne playing the piano for everyone to dance.
Yes.
And suddenly we're back into this really quite sad stuff of Anne's emotions, where it says that Anne offered her services as usual, and though her eyes would sometimes fill with tears as she sat at the instrument, she was extremely glad to be employed and desired nothing in return but to be unobserved. So after this great informal discussion, it's back with Anne's emotions.
Yes.
Which is how the chapter finishes. So I guess that sort of feeds in with the chapters we've been talking about today. Started with Anne being sort of psyching herself up to having to meet Wentworth again, and then finishes with his cold politeness and ceremonious grace.
And the sort of tension she lived through all these meetings, listening to him, mentioning things that brought back the past, and looking at him and thinking, is he still the same? Is he remembering that? And then right at the end is sort of this absolute clunk, where he speaks so coldly to her, but he's more or less saying to her, I don't
care about you anymore.
Yes.
So, favourite sentences?
The sentence I've got is, those were pleasant days when I had the Laconia. How fast I made money in her. And I chose that one because, like Sir Thomas having interest, there's these ones where you get absolutely shocked at the mercenary way privilege and patriotism and everything else is looked at by Jane Austen. One is so shocked by not so much even the difference in values as in the difference in values that it's completely legitimate and admirable to voice.
So did you have a favourite sentence, Michael?
So I'm going to go with one of Mrs Croft's. And the obvious one would have been, but I hate to hear you talking so like a fine gentleman, as if women were all fine ladies instead of rational creatures.
Yes.
However, just to be perverse, I'm going to go with the next sentence. We none of us expect to be in smooth water all our days.
So what?
Which is in some ways almost the theme of the novel.
Yes, exactly. That's what I was going to say.
Mrs Croft, she picks the metaphor that goes with the Navy.
Indeed.
And it also highlights Mrs Croft as one of the most awesome women.
Yes.
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 Well, I'm going to go for just something I just find really funny. After Mrs Croft has talked about going to Bermuda and the Bahamas, which, as you know, we do not call the West Indies, Mrs Musgrove had not a word to say in dissent. She could not accuse herself of having ever called them anything in the whole course of her life. The character we're talking about in this episode is Captain Wentworth. And I think he's Michael's favourite Jane Austen hero.
Yes. He, to me, is the only really convincing Jane Austen hero. Most of her others are, to me, in various ways disappointing. Well, unconvincing.
The First Impressions podcast, Kristen from that podcast absolutely hates Captain Wentworth. I went back and listened to quite early in their run, and they did some episodes on Persuasion, and she, I think, doesn't think he was fair on Anne in the first place when she broke off the engagement, but she just thinks the way he comes in and he doesn't care how much he's hurting Anne as he waltzes around flirting with the Musgrove girls, she just really doesn't like him. And I can see that point of view.
Yes, but to me...
I think you're about to say pretty much what Maggie said in response to Kristen in the podcast. Which is that it makes him believable. Because that's what people do.
Yes, that's right. It makes him believable. I think what makes Captain Wentworth particularly interesting is when he comes back, he is an angry man. I think it's too easy to just talk about it in terms of, he's an angry man because he was jilted, while ignoring what he's been doing ever since. That he has been living a violent, traumatic life where he's constantly having to prove himself. And he is driven through that career by being this controlled, angry, I'm going to prove to everyone that I deserve my place in the world. And to some extent, I see the novel as you starting to see him come to terms with himself, come to terms with that anger that he's been carrying as he starts to move into this new stage of his life. I think he's interesting to me precisely because he is a man in transition, a man who's dealt with so many things I don't want to use the Roy Batty Blade Runner thing, but, I've seen terrible things, also extraordinary things. But I don't think we should underestimate that. I think at least some of her contemporary readers would have to be aware of that. And whilst her brothers hadn't gone through anything like that, she certainly would have seen that happening at the time, with all these naval officers being back on the beach. So I think for me he's a character in a way that most of the others are not. We see these many facets of his personality, good and bad, and how they coalesce through the novel. He is a driven man. He's a passionate man. He begins the novel as an angry man.
That is new to me, Michael, but I think you're absolutely right, and I think that is a wonderful opening up of what he's like. I mean, we do see the anger. I don't know to what extent we can add in his awful experiences as a naval officer.
I also think that's really interesting, but I'm not sure I would say he is an angry man at the start. I would say he is a resentful man at the start. I think he's still carrying a vast amount of resentment. I'm not sure whether I'd say anger.
No, look, I think you could almost say angry. The way he goes on to Louisa about support your sister in her strength. He is so fierce about that.
So I agree with you that there is resentment there, but I see it all balled up in this feeling that he constantly has to fight through the world. He constantly...
Because of course, it says that he had no interest. So... all of his advancement in his career has been on his abilities.
He's constantly having to prove that he is better than all the others. He's not given anything. He has to strive and prove it violently.
Yes. I suppose actually one of the things he has got going for him is Jane Austen keeps telling us how much people liked him. He doesn't sell himself. He somehow has the ability. Well, he's just dead lucky, isn't he?
But I think we see many times in the novel evidence that he is very good at suiting himself to the company.
Yeah. And he goes and he sits next to Mrs Musgrove and he talks to her about poor Richard and he lets her talk to him about poor Richard. And he's not thinking poor Richard, he's thinking useless, wasteful Dick Musgrove. So glad I was able to get rid of him. But he doesn't say any of that.
That was the example that was in my mind when I said it.
It's partly courtesy, but it's also probably based on a genuine consideration for other people.
Yes. So that's the other thing. He's this angry man, but he's not only that. He has awareness. He does notice others.
This is why he's got his promotions, because his good characteristics are pretty easy to see. I think that's another thing.
Actually, of course, another thing we have is that while poor Richard / Dick was on his ship, that was the only time he wrote home. He said in that letter he was only too particular about the schoolmaster, which the notes say basically means he was doing his job as the captain and making sure that the young boys on the ship were getting the education they were supposed to get.
Yes, it's absolutely designed to show us that he's a conscientious officer who takes his responsibility to his midshipmen, even the awful midshipmen that get foisted upon him very seriously.
He will still sit them down and put a pen in their and ink in their hands and say, right.
When did you last write to your parents?
Yes.
No, you can't just ask for money.
Yes.
I'd just like to talk a bit about how we see Wentworth's feelings changing throughout the novel, because it's all external. As you said earlier, we don't get inside Wentworth's head except a little bit in the chapter we talked about today, but you can track his changing attitudes towards Anne throughout the book, though it is kind of hard to work out exactly when he recognised his feelings were changing. We have this progression. So in the chapters we saw today, it finished with that his cold indifference. So he's deliberately saying, I want to marry anyone except Anne Elliot. Then you have the lovely scene where little Walter has climbed onto her back and Captain Wentworth, without saying anything, just takes Walter off her back. So now we're seeing he's sort of kind of past that anger and indifference and is starting to feel for her a bit. And then the next bit is when he gets the Crofts to drive her home.
Yeah.
When we're not really told exactly what he thought, except Anne's emotional responses to both of those things. Then in Lyme, when he sees Mr. Elliot's admiration, and suddenly you're getting that, maybe not a twinge of jealousy yet, but certainly recognising that other people, and
He thinks, oh, she is nice looking. But also when she's with Bennick, yes, she is really interesting to be with.
we've actually got so much happening in Lyme in terms of his emotions, because we've got that. Then, of course, Louisa falls, and Anne is the one who's competent. Then he praises Anne's nursing ability to look after Louisa. So what I was kind of wondering is, in that period in Lyme, does he at that point suddenly recognise that he's moving back towards Anne from Louisa, or is it not until the moment, which we don't see, that Harville assumes he is about to be engaged to Louisa, that's his moment of realisation that he doesn't want to marry Louisa?
Well, I don't think she tells us.
I also think Wentworth, because he was so angry and resentful when Anne broke off the engagement, I don't think he ever really understood why she broke it off. He thought she was doing what Lady Russell was telling her to do, and that was because Lady Russell was saying he's not good enough, and he completely missed the fact that Anne was actually thinking she might hold him back in his career if they were engaged.
Perhaps because he thought she should have trusted in him. So it might have been partly a bit of offended vanity.
Yeah.
That he had this faith and she didn't have it.
Yeah.
I think it's deeper than offended vanity. He has had to live his life betting on himself, believing that if he puts his effort into it, he can achieve, because that's his only option. And so for her to suggest that he might fail is so threatening to his sense of self.
He probably saw it as she didn't trust him and therefore wasn't willing to put her future in his hands. And what he missed was she was afraid that if they were engaged, that would have an impact on him and she would be holding him back.
Yes.
And that's two very different things, and he's just completely missing that.
Yes.
When Michael joined us during our Mansfield Park season, he was talking about the Navy in connection with William Price. Well, he's back again to talk about the Navy, but this time different aspects of it in connection with Captain Wentworth and Persuasion.
So today, as Harriet said, I plan to talk about Captain Wentworth's career as a master and commander and then a post-captain, which will also help explain how exactly he made £25,000 in the war. The dinner party conversation in Chapter 8 provides us with quite a lot of detail, so my job will be to try and unpack some of those details and terminology that modern readers are unlikely to be familiar with, unless, like me, they are Patrick O'Brian fans. Jane Austen herself clearly picked up a fair amount of knowledge about the Royal Navy from her two naval brothers, Francis and Charles. Although Captain Wentworth's career is clearly modelled on that of one of the most distinguished, but also most controversial, naval captains of the Napoleonic Wars, Lord Cochrane, who incidentally was later used by both Forrester and O'Brien as the model for their protagonists, Horatio Hornblower and Jack Aubrey. Lord Cochrane's real life is far more improbable than anything that Wentworth, Hornblower or Aubrey do. The first thing to say is that unlike modern navies, promotion to both commander and to captain in the Royal Navy in this period was directly linked to the command of a ship. So you could not become a commander or a master and commander until you were appointed to command of a ship. And this became an increasing problem for ambitious officers at the time, as the number of eligible candidates greatly exceeded the supply of ships.
I found it interesting that the notes in my Cambridge edition said that in 1812 there were 586 commanders in the Navy list, but only 168 sloops.
But those are the ones who've made it to commander, so those are the ones who at some point in their career have commanded one of those. There would be thousands of lieutenants who've reached the seniority where they would be eligible to become commanders, but never get it because they never get command of...
Which might happen to William Price, who's been made lieutenant by the end of Mansfield Park.
Yes.
But who knows what happens next.
So the overwhelming majority of lieutenants never make it to commander, and so they either stay lieutenants for the rest of their career, or many of them then leave for the merchant service or the East India.
Oh, that was going to ask you, did they transfer to the merchant service?
Yes. Admiral Croft is therefore entirely correct in saying that Wentworth was a lucky fellow to get anything so soon with no more interest than his. So we might assume that perhaps Admiral Croft and his connections had some influence on Wentworth's career, but probably not a lot. Certainly there is no indication, for example, that Admiral Croft was the admiral of any of the squadrons that Wentworth was part of.
Yes.
Certainly what we hear of Admiral Croft's career does not match up with Wentworth's. However, it is also true that the admiral commanding a squadron had significant leeway in choosing the commanders of the small, unrated vessels under their command. And they also had a vested financial interest in appointing enterprising commanders. So it was in their own financial interests as well as strategic interests to give commands to exceptional officers. So this brings us to the matter of prize money.
Just before we get on to prize money, once someone had been made a captain, how did they then get themselves promoted to admiral?
So the first thing to say is that flag rank advancement in the 18th and 19th century Royal Navy was determined entirely by seniority, and it happened automatically. If you had reached the rank of post-captain, in theory at least, you were always going to become an admiral provided you lived long enough. So initial promotion to flag rank from the rank of captain occurred when a vacancy appeared on the admiral seniority list due to the death or retirement of a flag officer. The captain in question would then be automatically promoted to rear admiral and assigned to the first of the three coloured squadrons: blue, white and red. So Admiral Croft, as a rear admiral of the white, has reached the second of the 9 ranks within the overall rank of admiral. So first you were a rear admiral of the blue, then a rear admiral of the white, then a rear admiral of the red. Then you went up to being a vice admiral of the blue, a vice admiral of the white, a vice admiral of the red, and then finally to being an admiral of the blue, admiral of the white, an admiral of the red, and right at the very top there was the admiral of the fleet. But it's important to recognise that there was no promotion based on merit at flag rank. Even Lord Nelson was only a vice admiral of the white squadron at the time of his death at Trafalgar. Now back to my notes. This brings us to the matter of prize money, which is perhaps amongst the most surprising aspects of naval life in this period for modern audiences to understand. So prize money had been part of naval practice going back to the Elizabethan era. But in 1708, prize money was regulated when Parliament passed the Cruisers and Convoys Act. This formalised the process of prize taking, giving practically all the money gained from the capture of enemy vessels to the captors for the better and more effectual encouragement of the sea service. Every prize appeared before the High Court of Admiralty for condemnation, after which it was laid out in regulations the processes for dividing the proceeds among the various interested parties. Of note from the point of view of persuasion is the Act was altered in 1808, changing the distribution of prize money, giving less money to the captain and more to the commanding admiral. Another reason for Captain Wentworth to be fortunate to be at sea in the year 6. So before 1808, the captain received 3/8 of the entire value of a prize. After 1808, they only get 2/8, a quarter.
I can see you've got a table showing all the shares. I'll put that in the show notes rather than having you read it out, but it goes from captain right down to regular sailors.
That sounds quite generous. I mean, it does at least acknowledge they did something towards it.
It is very clear that the Navy was perhaps the only way that an ordinary working person could become wealthy in a day.
Are you going to explain where the money came from?
So the ships were captured. They were then taken into a friendly port. And then the Admiralty Court firstly deemed that they were a valid prize.
Yes.
And then they sent them for auction, both the ships themselves and their cargoes.
Yes.
Then the Admiralty Court distributed that money to the prize agents of the captain and his crew. As we hear in Chapter 8, Captain Wentworth's first command was a sloop, the Asp. This is what's known as an unrated ship. This means that it is a smaller vessel commanded by a master and commander rather than a post captain. Just to confuse things, however, masters and commanders did have the courtesy title of captain and would have been addressed as such. So during the 18th and 19th century, a sloop of war was defined by the Royal Navy as a warship with a single gun deck that carried up to 18 guns. These small vessels were ideal for intercepting enemy merchant ships and making raids on coastal settlements, and were frequently sent off on their own, giving their commanders a high degree of independence. Wentworth's capture of a French frigate, a much larger vessel, is clearly inspired by the most famous exploit of Lord Cochrane's early career. On the 6th of May 1801, while commanding the sloop Speedy, which had 14 guns and a crew of 54 men, he captured the Spanish xebec frigate El Gamo, which carried 32 guns and 319 men.
That makes him sound marvellous, doesn't
Yes,
it?
that is a feat so improbable that if you put it in a film, no one would believe it. So at this point, I'm going to nitpick on one of Jane Austen's most amusing lines in Chapter 8, where Captain Wentworth says, "The Admiralty," he continued, "entertained themselves now and then with sending a few hundred men to sea in a ship not fit to be employed." Now, as Cochrane's sloop had a crew of 54 men, it is wildly improbable that the Asp, which is a sloop, could put to sea with a crew of several hundred men. That's the crew level of a frigate, the next largest. Wentworth's next command, the Laconia, was a frigate. These were the most prized type of ship to command in the Royal Navy. Frigates were amongst the smallest of post ships, in other words, vessels commanded by a post captain rather than a master and commander. We might therefore reasonably assume that commanding a 2 or 3 decker line of battleship would be more sought after. However, while such a command was prestigious, these large vessels spent most of the war on blockade duty, ensuring the French and Spanish fleets could not break out into the Atlantic, and therefore were very unlikely to gain much in the way of prize money. Frigates, by contrast, were fast-sailing vessels, larger than a sloop, with a heavier armament and larger crew, several hundred, but still with a single deck of guns. So frigates were known for their speed and their fine sailing qualities, which made them ideally suited to commerce raiding. Wentworth's lovely cruise off the Western Islands in the Caribbean and another in the Mediterranean gave him ample opportunity to capture French and Spanish merchant shipping. Given that he would personally receive 1/8 the value of all the ships and cargo he captured, it is no wonder he exclaims, "Ah, those were pleasant days when I had the Laconia. How fast I made money in her."
Yes.
1995, in my opinion, was peak Jane Austen adaptation. That was the year of the BBC Pride and Prejudice. It was the year of the Emma Thompson Ang Lee Sense and Sensibility.
Oh my goodness.
It was the year of Clueless.
Yes.
And it was the year of the BBC film version of Persuasion, starring Amanda Root and Kieran Hines.
In my opinion, the best Jane Austen adaptation of all time.
And do you agree, Harriet?
I would say it is the best Persuasion adaptation, But while I find many aspects of this adaptation absolutely superb, there are moments in it that I find so jarring that they pull me out of it and it takes me a while to get back into it.
Whilst I understand that, I think this version has, for me, the perfect Wentworth and the perfect Anne Elliot, and that's enough to make it the most perfect for me.
A couple of general points about it. Because this is not a mini-series, it's a film, it was 1 hour 43 minutes in length. So obviously they've made some cuts. It was filmed completely on location, using all natural light, with little to no makeup, and it was shot in chronological order, which is unusual and interesting, although I don't know how much impact actually has on what we see in the end. Anne Elliot was played by Amanda Root, who was 32 at the time. Captain Wentworth was played by Kieran Hines, who was 42 at the time. I commented with the 1971 BBC that the Anne was kind of one note all the way through. You didn't get much change. Amanda Root's Anne Elliot visibly changes throughout the film. She does get her bloom back. At the start of the film, when you first see her at Kellynch, she's just crushed under everybody else, hardly says anything. Sometimes she looks like a frightened mouse. When she gets to Uppercross, however, she's quite positive, and when she's at the big house, she's smiling to them. When she's at Lyme in the Harvilles' house, everyone, including Anne, is just laughing in delight. When she starts out, her hair is very flat. By the end, it's softer, it's a little bit more bouffant on the forehead. It just looks so much more attractive. Up until Bath, when she's been outside, she's mainly worn this very dark grey cloak. When she's in Bath, she's wearing a pink pelisse. And so you just get this visual, Anne is getting her bloom back, both in the performance and in the look. And I think that just works so, so well. I would hands down say Amanda Root is my absolute favourite actress to play Anne Elliot. I think she really gets the character.
So I absolutely agree with you that Amanda Root is perfect. But I think for me, Kieran Hines is so much my vision of Captain Wentworth. In particular, as I was talking about earlier, it's the first time I've seen on screen the anger and the power that underpins that, and which every now and then appears in his performance. And so I think he, for me, is the perfect Captain Wentworth.
Yeah, I like him. I don't find him perfect in the same way I find Amanda Root perfect, but I can see why you do. So in terms of the other cast members, it is a good cast. Mary Musgrove is played by Sophie Thompson, who 1 year later was to play Miss Bates in Emma, but she is just such a good character and comic actress. She is wonderful.
She's brilliant in this.
Charles Musgrove is played by Simon Russell Beale. I think he's great as Charles, and I subsequently discovered many years later when I looked him up in Wikipedia that he is considered one of the finest stage actors of his generation. And the reason I haven't seen him much is because he's mostly done stage work. Mrs Croft is played by the wonderful Fiona Shaw. Sir Walter Elliot doesn't quite work for me because I don't like his voice, but I don't have any issue with it in terms of consistency with the character in the book. Mr Elliot is played by Samuel West. I quite like his performance, and he's pretty, which works. My only problem is he looks significantly younger than both Anne and Elizabeth. So it just doesn't quite work for me, but I have no issues with his performance or indeed with his looks as such. Elizabeth Elliot is played by Phoebe Nichols, who was Cordelia in the 1980s Brideshead Revisited. And I love her as an actress. She's great, but the way the part is written in this is just, it's so not Elizabeth of the book, because she's always slumped back in a chair. She can be shrill. This is one of the things that when she's there, it really spoils it for me. And I am not in any way criticising Phoebe Nichols. I think she is probably doing a great performance of the part she was given, but I find it very jarring.
She is almost the opposite of the character in the book.
And she's no sort of fine lady at all.
No, she's not elegant. She's not decorous. As I said, she sits slumped back in a chair with her feet stuck out.
Which means she never had a proper governess.
Well, no, this one clearly crushed the governess's will.
Now, I just want to comment on a few things I noticed in it. Michael pointed out, I hadn't really picked up on the amount of background presence of servants, not in the way some of the others do, where they have the servants there deliberately to say, look how lazy these people are, how privileged these people are, to see the servants in the background. In this case, they're just there in the background, they're just doing stuff. It feels like an inhabited world.
Yes.
When Anne is going to Uppercross, she's not being taken there by Lady Russell. She's travelling on a cart. It's a farmer's cart. I can see why they did that. It was all about Anne is unregarded by her family. They go away in their big carriage and she is just on a farmer's cart to get to Mary's place. Yeah. But I still found it very, very jarring.
It was overdone.
Yeah, it was overdone.
Yes.
On the other hand, I think one of the best scenes in it is the bit in the book where everyone complains to Anne.
Yes.
You just have, in a sequence, shot after shot after shot of people complaining to Anne in all different locations, and Anne is just sitting there and listening. Sometimes she has a cup of tea, sometimes she doesn't. But then right at the end, there's this extra moment that I think is so cute. Anne is sitting in a sofa, and Charles sort of slumps down next to her and says, "Oh, Anne." And for me, that moment actually said, Charles and Anne still have a good relationship.
Yes.
They get on with each other.
I just see that completely differently as the epitome of this is her life at Uppercross.
No, see, that one, though, I thought she smiled back at him. You know, in the book, it talks about how the little boys like Admiral Croft.
Yes.
When Mrs Croft and Admiral Croft are visiting, the two little boys run into the room and Admiral Croft gets them each on one of his knees and shows them rocking back and forth at sea, and then he makes a little paper boat for them, and you just get this lovely picture of Admiral Croft being so good with the little boys.
Yes.
And also Anne, because then they're sailing the paper boat in a little stream and Anne is sort of with them doing
encouraging.
It's one of the first times you actually see her animated.
Yes.
She's blossoms out beyond the little boys in being animated. Yes.
Now, when Wentworth arrives in the cottage, I talked earlier about how it's all about Anne's emotion.
Yes.
And what they do here is the camera zooms in on Anne's face, and then you see she has her hand behind her and she's just clutching the back of a chair. Oh. And I thought that really worked well to show the emotion she's feeling. But another scene I really love, and I think Michael loves this one too, is when Wentworth is talking about getting the asp. He says, "I was extremely keen at that time, in the year 6, to be at sea. Most extremely keen. I wanted to be doing something." He puts emphasis on in the year 6. And then after that, when the Admiral says, "Of course you weren't married at the time, you would have thought differently," and he says, "Well, I had no wife in the year 6. It's funny, but also character revealing.
Displaying his own emotion.
He is aware, by emphasising the year 6, that it will have extra meaning for Anne than it does for everyone else. And that, I feel, is very deliberate.
Yes,
and he delivers the line really well, and it works really well. The lime scenes, there are lots of shots of them standing on the pebble beach, and the Harvilles' house is really cramped and crowded, and that's one where the natural light with the candles and everything works well. As I said, I think when I was talking about the 1971, when they film in lime, there are 3 sets of steps on the cob. And all 3 of them are used in different adaptations. This one uses the steps that are halfway down that are called the Granny's Teeth. I've got a picture of them here, which will be included in the show notes. I might also put a link to a video comparing the scenes. They're the ones that look the most unsafe to go down.
Yes.
Also, you can see in that picture the picturesque barrels at the foot of the steps. I actually went to Lyme for the first time, maybe 7 or 8 years after this was filmed, and there was a very non-picturesque garbage bin at the bottom of the steps. So I think those barrels are hiding the garbage bin. Then, of course, we get the bath scenes. When Anne is talking to Mr. Elliot, she is flirting with him. She has come right out of her shell. Her eyes are expressive, she's laughing, she's smiling. This is not the crushed Anne we saw at Kellynch at the start. I think actually, looking at my notes, it's mostly in Bath that I find so many scenes that jar me quite a lot. After Captain Wentworth has arrived in the concert scene, in the book, he comes up to her, he's almost going to sit down in the space she's made, then she has to turn back and talk to Mr. Elliot. She turns back, and he basically says, "I'm going to go now, there's nothing for me here," and he leaves.
Yes.
In this, she sees him leaving and she gets up from her seat and runs to try and catch him. And she says, "You're not going to stay for this song. It's a very beautiful love song." And he says, "There is nothing for me here." And it's just heavy-handed and over the top. It just really pulled me out of it, and it took me a long time to get back in. And I'm not saying everything has to be exactly as it is in the book, But they could have done something more decorous, closer to the book, and I think those two actors would have carried it.
Oh, yeah.
I really do. The next scene, again, that really, really bothered me is they have incorporated the cancelled chapter from the book. Captain Wentworth comes to Anne and says, "The Admiral and Mrs Croft have heard that you are going to marry Mr Elliot and want to let you know that they will leave Kellynch and give up the rest of the lease if you want to move in there." And, of course, in the cancelled chapter, Anne tells him that she's not going to marry Mr Elliot, and lo, they are reconciled. Yeah. In this, she says, "He is too kind, but," and Wentworth says, "Just say it, yes or no." And Anne says, "Why is everyone assuming that?" And then Lady Russell arrives and cuts her off.
I don't object to them putting in the cancelled scene because I think it works as a really effective dramatic point, and because Kieran Hines' performance of delivering the message is really good.
I'm not saying his performance isn't good, because it is. What I object to is a simple word would have resolved it, and it gets subverted, and it's like a false ending, and it just interrupts the flow. The next thing, which is different from the book but which doesn't bother me in the slightest, is the scene with Mrs Smith giving Mr Elliot's backstory. They've compressed it and they've simplified it and they've changed it. Mr Elliot has lost all his money. He's broke. He needs to marry for money. That's why he's doing it. And I just think it works really well as a simplification. It's different from the book. Part of me thinks it would have been nice to keep the complexity of the book, but I can see that it works really well. And Mrs Smith and Nurse Rook, by the way, are also both really good. Anne says, "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" And they basically say, "We only just learned this last night." So you remove all these questions of why didn't Mrs Smith say it? So it also makes Mrs Smith a much less ambiguous character than she was in the book. The conversation with Harville while Wentworth is in the background, it's just a great scene.
Is that where you say Harville really comes into his own?
Yeah.
Yes.
Most of it is the dialogue from the book. They both deliver it so well. There is one change. I'd almost go so far as to say it's an improvement from the book. You know how Harville talks about works of literature and then he says, "But you will say they were all written by men." And Anne says, "Yes, I think I will." Well, in this, he says his bit about works of great literature, and then Anne says, completely deadpan, "But they were all written by men."
Oh,
and
right.
it works really well. Then we have another scene that doesn't work for me. Instead of walking off down the gravel walk, they have their conversation there in the street, and a circus parade appears behind them. And I think the point of it is they're talking to each other and they kiss each other and they're just oblivious to what else is happening. Which I can see the point, but it just really, really didn't work for me.
So I have tried to make justifications for the other ones you hate, but I hate this one just as much. It's a completely bizarre decision.
Yeah. The last scene in the film is Anne sitting writing at a desk, and then she walks out and you realise she's on board a ship with Wentworth. It was actually filmed on the Victory. So Anne living Mrs Croft's life at sea, and the very, very last scene is a long shot of a ship at sea, which is actually a clip taken from the movie of The Bounty. As I said, there are scenes in this that I find really jarring and really pull me out, so I'm still waiting for the perfect adaptation of Persuasion, but this is far and away the best adaptation I have seen, and the performances, almost without fail, are excellent.
Right.
So I would say that the perfection of the two main performances in this, as well as the many wonderful performances by other characters, allow me to forgive the flawed scenes, which I will also say don't bother me as much as they do Harriet.
In our last episode, when we were talking about the bit where everyone at Uppercross is complaining about each other to Anne, I said that I can't imagine that happening to Fanny. Now, two people have pointed out to me that, in fact, in Mansfield Park, that is exactly what happens during the play. Everyone is complaining to Fanny about everyone else. So, yes, I was obviously really stupid when I said that. And that's because I think I was thinking about Fanny in all those evenings when she's sitting there helping Lady Bertram with her work, not saying anything and not really being included in the conversation, but just listening. But during the play, yes, people are talking to her directly and complaining about each other. But I do think there is one important difference In Persuasion, people are basically hoping that Anne can drop a hint to Mary and actually make a change happen.
They're not just hoping, they're actually saying, could you mention this to Mary? Whereas nobody thinks that Fanny has got any agency.
No.
Basically, they're just venting to Fanny, whereas with Anne, they really think she might be able to do something about it.
Yeah.
Although, of course, Fanny put a terrible lot of time into trying to get Mr. Rushworth to learn his lines.
Yeah, true.
So she did try in the couple of places where she could do something.
Yeah. You've been listening to the Reading Jane Austen podcast with me, Harriet.
Me, Michael.
And me, Ellen. Next time, we're going to be reading chapters 9 and 10 of Persuasion.
The structure of this podcast was inspired by Harry Potter and the sacred text. Our music is Creative Commons performances of pieces Jane Austen might have listened to.
You can find us on our website, readingjaneausten.com. We're also on Facebook at Reading Jane Austen and Instagram at reading_Jane_Austen.
You can email us at readingjaneausten.com or rate and review us in your podcast app. We hope you'll join us next time.